Continuing from our previous discussion on the historical background of medieval philosophy, we now delve into two core concepts that really shaped the intellectual landscape: eternity and hierarchy. Think of them as the X and Y axes of medieval thought, eternity stretching across time and hierarchy stacking beings up vertically. Both concepts have roots in Neoplatonism, but they were given a distinctly medieval twist, largely thanks to figures like Boethius and Pseudo-Dionysius. These aren't just abstract ideas, they're fundamental assumptions and puzzles that underpin much of what follows in medieval philosophy. So, what exactly did eternal mean when medieval thinkers applied it to God? We usually think of eternity in two ways today. First, there's p-eternity, which is about perpetuity, things that just keep going. This can be pi, lacking a beginning, like counting down from infinity, pi, lacking an end, like counting up forever, or pi, lacking both a beginning and an end, like a perfect circle. Then there's O-eternity, or timelessness, something completely outside time, not measured by it, not existing at any point in time. Now, here's the kicker. Logically, you can't be both p-eternal and O-eternal. If you're p-eternal, you're existing at multiple times, maybe all of them. But if you're O-eternal, you're not at any time at all. Yet, surprisingly, many medieval thinkers believed God was both. Some even argued that being p-eternal somehow made God O-eternal. This immediately tells us something crucial. Their understanding of O-eternity wasn't quite our modern idea of pure timelessness. And it gets even more interesting. There was a real asymmetry in how they treated beginnings versus endings. For creatures, angels, human souls, even the punishment of the damned, the consensus was they had a start but no finish. They were pi-eternal. But when it came to lacking a beginning, pi, that was a different story. Thinkers like Richard of St. Victor and Henry of Ghent argued forcefully that it wasn't just that God created everything, but that it was metaphysically impossible for a creature to lack a beginning altogether. It was a unique feature of God, making pi-eternity, no beginning and no end, a special divine property. Imagine if someone said your dog has always existed. That sounds weird, right? Well, for creatures, lacking a beginning was just as strange. Also, since most believed time was created, something starting with time didn't automatically mean it lacked a beginning in an absolute sense. And finally, some weren't even thinking of time as the only kind of duration. Eternity and angelic aveternity might have been seen as stretching beyond time, or having some complex relationship with it, not just being timeless. It's a much richer, more dynamic picture than simple timelessness. Let's start with Boethius, the classic entry point for most medieval discussions. He was a Christian deeply immersed in Greek Neoplatonism. At first glance, his analysis seems straightforward. He clearly distinguishes between the way philosophers describe the world's duration, never begins nor ceases to be, extending alongside the infinity of time. Sounds like p-eternity, maybe even p and p. Then he contrasts this with God's eternity, famously defined as the whole, perfect, and simultaneous possession of unending life. On the surface, this looks like a clear separation between the world's endless stretch through time and God's unique, timeless state. Everything seems neat and tidy, right? But hold on. Most modern commentators insist Boethius meant timeless eternity. However, there's a compelling alternative reading. Maybe Boethius wasn't trying to define a special kind of duration called eternity, but was using the term to describe how God lives and knows. His definition, the whole, perfect, and simultaneous possession of unending life, could simply mean God's entire existence happens all at once. No change, no progression. Think about it. Our knowledge of the present is necessary. It's happening now. But does knowing that the sun is shining now constrain my freedom to decide whether to open the window? No. Boethius suggests God's eternal knowledge is like our knowledge of the present. It's necessary for him, but it doesn't limit the freedom of those he knows. So, maybe he's not saying God exists at no time, but rather that his life is lived in a unique, simultaneous way, distinct from anything else that endures forever. This avoids the tricky topology problem of simultaneous temporal parts. When he says temporal motion imitates eternity, he's talking about changing things trying to express the changing nature of God's life, not comparing the structure of time and eternity directly. It's less about God being outside time and more about God's mode of being within his own existence. Anselm takes this head-on in his Monologion. He lays out the paradox explicitly. First, God being truth must be without beginning or end. Second, God exists at every single moment of time because everything depends on him to exist. Okay, so far so good. But then comes the snag. God has no parts, he's perfectly simple. So if he exists at every time, how can he be a whole at every time? We aren't wholes spread across different moments. We are wholes at each moment, albeit separate wholes. God can't be broken into temporal pieces. How can a single, unchanging whole exist properly at all times, when times themselves are sequential, not simultaneous? This is the topological objection again. Anselm's solution is clever. He says God exists with time, not in time. Time doesn't contain God. God is present at every moment. Why can this work without being timeless? Because Anselm argues, time measures things by having a first and last moment. Since God lacks these bounds, time cannot measure him. And because time fails to act as a metric, it loses its usual topological structure. God is sufficiently different from temporal things to live his life simultaneously, yet still isn't timeless in the strictest sense. It's a fascinating attempt to reconcile omnitemporality with divine simplicity. Moving into the early 13th century, Paris was buzzing with debate. Two key sources emerge, the Sum Fratris Alexandri and Philip the Chancellor's Summa de Bono. The SFA, drawing heavily on Anselm, adds a neat hierarchy of durations. God's eternity, no beginning, no end, unchanging. The angels' eternity, a beginning, no end, unchanging. And then time, a beginning, no self-ending, changing, and ultimately ended by God. This helps bridge the gap between God's eternity and, say, the endlessness of hell. Like Anselm, the SFA holds onto God's presence at all times but emphasizes his unchangingness. Philip is even clearer. Eternity is a different kind of duration, not timeless but coexisting with time. He raises the puzzle. If time is infinite, can it measure eternity? If so, aren't they equal? His answers are twofold. Either infinite time only stretches forward while eternity has no start, or even if they're equal, they differ fundamentally. Time is succession. Eternity isn't. He uses the analogy of the now considered alone. It's a part of eternity. Put together with other nows, it makes time. So, Philip sees two concurrent durations, different in structure, with God in eternity, allowing for true temporal statements about God, provided they don't imply change. Now we get to Aquinas and Albert the Great. Aquinas, in his Summa Theologiae, really ramps up the tension towards timelessness. He acknowledges the difference between time and eternity, beginning and end, but quickly dismisses it as accidental, because he later believed God could have created a world without a temporal beginning. What really matters, he argues, is the lack of succession. Eternity is totesimal, all entirely at once. There's no ordering of earlier to later. This emphasis on being all at once strongly suggests an unextended, timeless state. He even compares eternity to a point at the center of a circle, with time being the circumference. But wait, there are passages where he seems to reject timelessness. He explains why the Bible uses temporal language of God, because God's eternity includes all times. And he argues temporal language misleads because God is immutable, not because he's timeless. Then there's Albert, Aquinas' former teacher. In his late work, Albert comes closer to proposing timelessness. For him, eternity is primarily God's never-beginning, never-ending existence. Any notion of infinite extension into past and future is merely in the mind of the person contemplating it. It's a psychological link to time, keeping divine eternity itself free from any temporal characteristics. It's a fascinating shift, leaning heavily towards timelessness, especially compared to the earlier Parisians. This brings us to a huge issue, the problem of prescience. If God knows everything, including what I'll do tomorrow, does that mean I have no choice? If I stay home, how can God's knowledge about me going to the opera be true? This feels like a threat to free will. Philosophers tried to formalize this. The simplest version, Statement 1, is flawed logically. A better version is Statement 2, which is consistent with free will. But the real challenge comes with Statement 3. Necessary. If God knew E will happen, then E will happen. The antecedent, God knew, refers to a past event, making it necessarily true in the sense of accidental necessity. Combine this with Statement 4, necessary, God knew E will happen, and many modal logics lead to Statement 5, E will happen necessarily. This is the accidental necessity argument. Now, here's where timelessness enters the picture. If God is truly timeless, meaning no tense statements apply to him, then God's knowing about the future isn't a past event. Statement 4 falls apart, and the whole argument collapses. This is often called the Boethian solution, and Aquinas is frequently grouped with Boethius here, suggesting they used timelessness to solve the prescience problem. But hold on, did Boethius and Aquinas actually use timelessness in this way? Let's look closer. Boethius' own formulation of the problem is closer to the flawed Statement 1. He wasn't really tackling the accidental necessity argument. Instead, he was trying to explain how future events can be necessary for God to know them, yet still open for human choice. He used the analogy of present knowledge. What's happening now is necessary, but knowing it doesn't constrain us. God's eternal knowledge of the future is like our knowledge of the present relative to Him. It's necessary for Him, but compatible with our freedom. Aquinas, however, knew the accidental necessity argument. He addressed it explicitly, and he didn't use timelessness to reject statement 4. Instead, he conceded statement 5. If God knew, then it necessarily happens. Then he threw in a complex principle about necessity being determined by the knower, not the known thing. This principle was supposed to show that the necessity in statement 5 was the harmless kind, like the necessity of the present. But his argument for this principle is frankly weak. Given that, it would be bizarre for Aquinas to rely on such shaky reasoning if he truly believed in timelessness as a solution. Therefore, Aquinas's treatment of prescience provides strong evidence that he did not consider divine eternity to be timeless. Alright, let's switch gears to hierarchy. This concept was massive for providing a sense of order in the medieval universe. It aimed to give every type of being, from God down to the lowest creature, a specific place and function. The big name associated with it is Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, writing around 500 AD. He defined hierarchy as sacred order, knowledge, and activity, assimilating itself to the likeness of God. Think of it as a cosmic ladder, reflecting God's own order. Dionysius presented two main hierarchies, the celestial or angelic one, which is the exemplar, and the ecclesiastical or human one, modeled on the first. The angelic hierarchy is famously structured into 9 orders, arranged in 3 triads, based on levels of closeness to God, knowledge, purity, and participation in divine secrets. It's a system of mediation where higher orders purify, illuminate, and perfect those below, and spirits ascend towards God through this process. Your rank depends on how closely you resemble God. Dionysius then mapped this onto the church and humanity, creating an ecclesiastical hierarchy. This also had 2 triads. The first triad includes the initiators, bishops who receive grace from angels and pass it down to priests, who pass it to ministers. The second triad includes the initiated, monks, holy people, and purified orders like penitents. The idea is that higher orders purify, illuminate, and perfect those below, acting as mediators. All orders spring directly from God, and divine interventions in history, like the law given to Moses or the Annunciation, were channeled through this angelic hierarchy. Knowledge of God's rule, thearchy, is also mediated through these orders. Angels get illumination instantly, while humans grasp it gradually, often through sacraments. Dionysius built this structure based on the actual church organization of his time, placing bishops at the top, corresponding to the lowest order of angels. How did this idea spread? Pope Gregory the Great popularized the 9 choirs of angels, and famously suggested that humans in heaven would form a 10th choir, filling the gap left by the fallen angels. Dionysius's works traveled widely, especially in Byzantium. Though Latin translations existed in the West earlier, they weren't widely cited until the 12th century. An exception is Hincmar of Reims, an archbishop who used the celestial hierarchy to bolster his own authority. He argued the Church, like heaven, is a divinely ordained institution with inherent inequalities. Authority flows downwards, mirroring the heavenly structure. This idea lay dormant until the 12th century revival of interest in thinkers like Eriugena and Honorius Augustodunensis. Hugh of St. Victor wrote a hugely influential commentary on the celestial hierarchy. He emphasized that grace, mediated by angels, gives divine illuminations, theophanies, and hierarchies guide humans back to God. This period saw the development of terms like supercelestial, celestial, subcelestial hierarchies, and specific types of angelic manifestations. The 13th century saw a flourishing of detailed descriptions. Alan of Lille defined hierarchy simply as lordship. Following Gregory, he said humans were created to fill the gap left by fallen angels. He used more accessible imagery, matching angelic functions to types of humans: contemplatives, rulers, defenders, miracle workers, etc., creating parallel 9-fold hierarchies for angels, humans, and demons. Then came William of Auvergne, a bishop and encyclopedist. His work, Magisterium Divinale, overflowed with descriptions of the universe. He compared angelic ranks not just to the clergy, but to the offices in a secular kingdom. Remarkably, he privileged the state, suggesting secular offices reflected the heavenly court directly. He even mentioned attempts to integrate Avicenna's theory of intelligences into Christian angelology. Hierarchy was becoming deeply intertwined with political and philosophical thought. By the later Middle Ages, hierarchy became a battleground for expressing personal views about earthly structures. Bonaventure, a Franciscan leader, applied hierarchy everywhere, from the Trinity to the planets. He saw the angelic hierarchy impressing the Trinity's triune nature onto the Church. There's a procession of grace from God down to humanity, and a reduction or ascent of creatures back to God. Within the Church, he distinguished between an active hierarchy, led by prelates, and a higher contemplative one, potentially giving the friars precedence over bishops. This culminated dramatically in Pope Boniface VIII's Unum Sanctum Bull of 1302. Declaring everyone subject to the Pope as chief intermediary, Boniface invoked Dionysius. The law of divinity is to lead the lowest through the intermediate to the highest. Giles of Rome echoed this. But Aquinas had already thrown a wrench into the works. While accepting hierarchy as a universal principle, he rejected the strict analogy between angelic and human hierarchies. Humans are equal by nature, grace is invisible, so human hierarchy is based on visible power, not holiness. He also denied a supercelestial hierarchy among the Trinity, and challenged the necessity of angels as essential intermediaries, arguing God can communicate directly via Christ, and humans can enlighten each other freely. Aquinas' doubts opened the door for criticism. Later thinkers focused on what this meant for spiritual authority. If human hierarchy isn't truly like the angelic one, does that mean the Pope isn't the ultimate intermediary? Does it mean the church hierarchy doesn't have temporal authority? Does it mean secular society isn't modeled on heaven, and that kings aren't subject to the Pope in worldly matters? John of Paris argued exactly this. Lay people are low in the church, but their civil order, guided by Aristotle, is separate and independent. Then there's the Lucifer problem, famously tackled by Wycliffe. He accepted hierarchy but asked, if Lucifer was cast out of the angelic order, shouldn't corrupt priests be cast out of the ecclesiastical one? Grosseteste had already used this logic in 1253 to refuse a papal appointment. Throughout the later Middle Ages, hierarchy became a flexible tool, invoked polemically in disputes between mendicant friars and secular clergy, between conciliarists and papal monarchists, always adjusted to fit the agenda of whoever was wielding it. Finally, by the Renaissance and Reformation, skepticism grew. Lorenzo Valla questioned whether Dionysius was really Paul's contemporary, a view supported by Erasmus. While Renaissance Platonists like Ficino admired Dionysius's Neoplatonism, Luther was scathing, calling him full of dreamlike curiosities and finding little sound learning. He even joked he could devise a better church hierarchy than Dionysius's just by putting the Pope above the bishops. Calvin was even harsher, dismissing the celestial hierarchy as mostly talk and denying any basis for comparing heavenly and earthly hierarchies. The intellectual tide was turning. So, wrapping up, despite all the debates, criticisms, and reinterpretations, the concept of hierarchy, rooted in Dionysius, profoundly shaped medieval visions of order in the church and society. It became a fundamental reference point, a necessary framework that thinkers had to engage with, adapt, and sometimes reject. Its legacy is evident in the countless ways it was invoked, debated, and reshaped throughout the later Middle Ages, becoming a ubiquitous tool in discussions about power, structure, and divine order.